Welcome back. Why won't President Trump echo his country's own intelligence agencies and consistently and clearly say that Russia interfered in the last election and is still interfering? And while the president avoids criticizing Vladimir Putin, he did have harsh words for former CIA Director John Brennan, who called his Putin press conference performance, quote, treasonous.
Well, I think Brennan's a very bad guy, and if you look at it, a lot of things happened under his watch. I think he's a very bad person.
Former CIA Director John Brennan joins me now. Director, thank you so much for being here. We do appreciate it.
Sure,
do you
Katie.
want to respond to the president?
Well, you know, when the president, Donald Trump, was elected president in November 2016, I was skeptical that he had the qualifications, the temperament, or even the potential to be a strong president. I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But soon after his election, he started to denigrate the intelligence and law enforcement profession, as well as professionals, as well as their work. And then over the past year and a half, I think he has demonstrated time and time again that he lies to the American people and that he is not fulfilling the responsibilities of the office of the presidency in terms of keeping this country strong and safe. I was hoping he was going to bring this country together after a very contentious election. And so I have been outspoken, and I have taken to the Twitter sphere. And some of my tweets, I will acknowledge, are rather shrill, if not strident. Maybe I'm just an intelligence officer, and I'm trying to ring the bell because I see all the warning signs here, especially when it comes to national security. I worked in national security in the government for close to 35 years, and on issues related to Iran and North Korea and proliferation and Russia. And when I see the types of things that Mr. Trump is doing, yes, I will speak out. I'm hoping to be able to shake some, quite frankly, some sense into the people around Mr. Trump and those on the Hill. Because the more that they tolerate and they make excuses for his behavior and his performance, the more they're enabling him, the more they're encouraging him to do these types of things. I don't know whether or not he can change his ways or not. I don't know if my tweets are making any difference whatsoever. But I feel it's my personal obligation, and I'm going to stay true to my principles. And the fact that, you know, Mr. Trump calls me a bad person, well, I need to be able to speak openly and clearly about the concerns that I see in terms of the future security and safety of this country.
You say you can see the threats coming. Is the president of the United States himself a threat?
Well, I think the way he has behaved and the way he has acted, again, this 2-hour one-on-one with Mr. Putin.
But you know more than I know. You know more than any of us know. We know what we've seen in public. You know what happened during the 2016 election.
I know what the Russians did, absolutely, and I had good insight into it. And I know how capable and sophisticated and cunning the Russians are, as well as how clever Mr. Putin is as a trained KGB officer. And 2 hours with Donald Trump, I have real questions about that. And why did he not trust John Bolton and Mike Pompeo and John Kelly to be in that meeting? When he was there with his translator, was that translator excused? Did he pass written notes to Mr. Putin and to the Russian translator so that our translator would not see it? I don't know, but there's something that is very, very puzzling about this, and I am concerned because I know how manipulative the Russians are and Mr. Putin is. And as the special counsel's investigation continues to go forward, we are going to find out the facts as Bob Mueller uncovers them about whether or not there were individuals that were very close to Mr. Trump and in the campaign who were actively abetting and aiding the Russian efforts to interfere in that election.
Why did July 27th, 2016, that press conference where he asked Russia to hack into Hillary Clinton's emails, why did that raise so many red flags?
Well, because it was basically overt collusion, encouraging the Russians to try to find her emails. And so we see, you know, collusion in plain sight. Now the question is whether things that are going on behind the scenes that may have, in fact, helped Mr. Trump get elected. He was elected. I know whenever he sees this issue, he's concerned that this is undermining the legitimacy of his election, and so he keeps going back to this issue. There was no collusion, no collusion. Well, we need to get to the bottom about what the Russians did and who they did it with, and I have great confidence in Bob Mueller and going forward.
Do you think that he's concerned about it undermining the legitimacy of his own election because he knows that what happened helped him? He knows that the WikiLeaks leaks helped him, that he might know more than that.
I think it's quite clear that the Russian active measures and what they were doing was influential and changed at least one vote. Did it change one vote or a million votes? You never can know the answer to that question. So whether or not it was the Russian assistance that might have gotten Mr. Trump over the finish line is unknown. And we shouldn't go there. What we should do is try to understand exactly who was doing what during that election and hold them to account. Hold the Russians to account and hold any American persons, U.S. persons to account for actively working with the Russians.
What happened within the CIA when Donald Trump said that at that July 27th press conference?
Well, I think a lot of us were very, very concerned about what he was doing, encouraging the Russians. And now, as we know, coming out of the indictments that Rod Rosenstein had announced the other day, that very day, that very night, the Russians were going and looking for, emails and other things. So having a candidate for the presidency of the United States openly encourage the Russians to do this, I think, was just an abomination and something that I find unconscionable.
There was a joint press statement that came out on October 7th. You were part of that said that Russia was trying to meddle in the election. Did you know then, or were you suspicious then, that Donald Trump or somebody on his team may have been working to time the release of those emails?
We were concerned that the Russians were going to take advantage of whatever types of contacts or intermediaries they had in order to further their aims. And so, again, I will defer to Bob Mueller and the FBI and those that have to investigate any type of U.S. person collusion or cooperation. Again, witting or unwitting. But during that September, October, and early November timeframe, we were trying to understand just the scope and scale of what the Russians were doing. We were trying to understand exactly what they might, in fact, throw into this election, discussion, but also be able to make sure that we were able to not just understand it, but also keep President Obama informed as well as the congressional leadership informed.
Were you suspicious or concerned that there may have been collusion or coordination going on between the Trump campaign or Donald Trump and the Russians after that July 27th press conference?
I was very concerned that the Russians were going to continue what they've done for many, many years, which was to use their presence in the United States and their contacts with American persons to be able to advance their objectives.
That's not a no.
That is not a no. That is not a no. I am concerned about, again, whether or not someone was an unwitting part of this master plan on the part of the Russians, or whether the people were actively working with the Russians. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on that. I just know that the Russians take full advantage of the freedoms and liberties of this great country in order to ply their intelligence trade.
What do you think those in the CIA and in the intelligence community are thinking now, a year and a half into Donald Trump's presidency, and after we've seen him openly deny the assessment that they've made over and over and over again, after they saw him stand next to Vladimir Putin and praise Vladimir Putin while attacking his own DOJ and his own FBI and passing off conspiracy theories about the DNC server?
I think many of them are, shocked and appalled and continue to scratch their heads over why a person who is the President of the United States is doing this. But at the same time, I have confidence that the women and men of CIA and FBI and NSA are going to do their absolute best, irrespective of the person in the Oval Office, to try to keep this country strong.
One last question. What do you think of the Sarah Huckabee Sanders today coming out and saying that the president is having conversations about allowing Russians to question Ambassador Michael McFaul and Bill Browder?
I think it's the height of absurdity to say that we're going to allow sort of Russian officials to question former American U.S. officials on this matter. This is just continued efforts on the part of the Russians, Mr. Putin and others, to try to have distractions. And unfortunately, I think Mr. Trump falls prey to them.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.